In 1964, three engineers at Pontiac, John DeLorean, Bill Collins, and Russ G., did something that was technically against company policy. They took a mid-sized Pontiac Tempest, pulled out the standard engine, and dropped in a massive 389 cubic inch V8 from the full-sized cars. General Motors had a rule: no engine bigger than 330 cubic inches in intermediate cars. But DeLorean found a loophole. GM's rules covered new models, not option packages, so they offered it as the GTO option and started taking dealer orders before the executives in Detroit even knew it existed. By the time GM's corporate brass found out, Pontiac had 5,000 orders. There was no turning back. The GTO hit the market in September 1963, and the muscle car era was born. Pontiac had just created an entirely new category of American automobile. For the next 2 decades, Pontiac was General Motors' performance division. The Firebird, the Trans Am, the Grand Prix. "We build excitement" wasn't just a slogan. It was what Pontiac actually did. The brand reached its peak in the mid-1980s, selling over 850,000 cars in a single year. But on April 27, 2009, General Motors announced that Pontiac would be discontinued. The last Pontiac rolled off the assembly line on January 4, 2010. 84 years of American performance gone. This is the story of how the brand that invented the muscle car was killed after 84 years. Chapter 1. The companion car that killed its parent. Pontiac didn't start as Pontiac. The story begins with a company called Oakland. Edward Murphy founded the Oakland Motor Car Company in 1907 in Pontiac, Michigan. Murphy had made his fortune manufacturing horse-drawn carriages. And like many carriage makers of that era, he saw automobiles as the future. The company he built in Pontiac, a small city about 30 miles north of Detroit, started producing cars almost immediately. The early Oakland cars weren't particularly special. 2-cylinder engines, basic designs, modest sales. But Oakland was building a reputation for solid, reliable vehicles at reasonable prices. In 1909, the company introduced a line of 4-cylinder cars that sold considerably better. That same year, something more significant happened. General Motors bought Oakland. William C. Durant had founded General Motors just 1 year earlier, in 1908, as a holding company for Buick. Durant was building an automotive empire by acquiring smaller car companies. He bought Oldsmobile. He bought Cadillac. And in 1909, he added Oakland to his growing collection of brands. Oakland became one of GM's core divisions, positioned as a mid-priced option between Chevrolet and Oldsmobile. Through the 1910s and early 1920s, Oakland grew steadily. By 1916, the company had introduced its first 6-cylinder engine, joining the industry trend toward more powerful, smoother-running motors. Oakland was successful, profitable, and secure within the GM family. But by the mid-1920s, GM's leadership had developed a new strategy. Alfred P. Sloan Jr., who had taken over as GM's president, believed the company needed to fill every possible price point in the market. Each GM division would have a companion brand, a slightly less expensive option designed to capture buyers who wanted something better than Chevrolet but couldn't quite afford the main brand. Cadillac would get LaSalle, Buick would get Marquette, Oldsmobile would get Viking, and Oakland would get Pontiac. The first Pontiac made its debut at the 1926 New York Auto Show. GM called it the Chief of the Sixes, a reference to Chief Pontiac, the Ottawa war leader who had led an uprising against British forces in the 1760s. The car featured a 6-cylinder engine in a vehicle priced to compete with 4-cylinder models. You got more power for the same money. That value proposition resonated immediately. Pontiac sold well, very well. Better than Oakland, in fact. The companion brand started outselling its parent almost from the beginning. Buyers liked the Pontiac name, the styling, and especially the performance-to-price ratio. Oakland's sales, meanwhile, started to decline. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression was devastating the American economy. Car sales collapsed across the industry. GM looked at its portfolio of brands and made hard decisions about which ones to keep. The companion brand strategy had mostly failed. LaSalle, Marquette, and Viking were all discontinued within a few years. But with Oakland and Pontiac, GM made an unusual choice. Instead of keeping the original Oakland brand and dropping the companion Pontiac, they did the opposite. Oakland was discontinued after the 1931 model year. Pontiac survived and took Oakland's place as a full GM division. The companion had killed its parent. In 1932, the Oakland name disappeared entirely. The division was renamed Pontiac Motor Division. What had started as a side project, a companion brand to fill a pricing gap, had become one of General Motors' core automotive divisions. Pontiac had won, and it was just getting started. Chapter 2: Silver Streaks and Independence. Having survived the Depression by replacing Oakland, Pontiac spent the next 3 decades building an identity. And that identity came down to 2 things: distinctive styling and genuine innovation. In 1934, Pontiac became the first division of General Motors to offer independent front suspension. That might sound like a minor technical detail, but it mattered. Independent front suspension meant each front wheel could move up and down independently, rather than being connected by a solid axle. The result was a smoother ride, better handling, and improved tire wear. Pontiac was offering technology that other GM divisions wouldn't adopt for years. Then came the Silver Streaks. In 1935, Pontiac introduced chrome strips that ran from the grille back across the hood to the cowl. These weren't just decorative, they became Pontiac's visual signature. You could spot a Pontiac from a block away because of those gleaming silver streaks. The styling element stuck around for decades, becoming so associated with the brand that people just called Pontiacs Silver Streaks. The strategy worked. In 1936, just 10 years after the brand's introduction, Pontiac built its 1 millionth car. The division was growing, gaining market share, and establishing itself as a solid mid-priced option in GM's lineup. World War II interrupted civilian car production as Pontiac's factories, like all American automotive plants, converted to military manufacturing. The division produced aircraft engines, anti-aircraft guns, and other war materials. When the war ended in 1945, Pontiac returned to building cars for a nation hungry for new vehicles after years of wartime scarcity. The 1950s brought continued growth. Pontiac introduced the Bonneville in 1957, a full-sized car with Pontiac's first fuel-injected engine. The Bonneville represented Pontiac's push-up market, targeting buyers who wanted something more luxurious than the standard Pontiac, but didn't want to step up to Oldsmobile or Buick. But by the late 1950s, Pontiac had a problem. The brand had developed a reputation as the car your grandmother drove. Reliable, yes. Well-built, certainly. But exciting? Not particularly. Pontiac was selling to an older demographic, and younger buyers were looking elsewhere. Everything changed when Seaman Bunky Knudsen arrived as general manager in 1956. Knudsen understood that Pontiac needed to shed its stodgy image and appeal to younger, performance-oriented buyers. He assembled a team of talented engineers and designers with a clear mission: make Pontiac exciting. Knudsen introduced wide-track Pontiacs, cars with wider wheelbases that improved handling and gave Pontiacs a lower, more aggressive stance. The styling became sleeker, more powerful looking. And crucially, Knudsen took Pontiac racing. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, Pontiac competed in NASCAR and drag racing. The division built high-performance engines, developed racing technology, and won races. The wins translated directly into sales. Young buyers who wanted performance started looking at Pontiac. The brand's image transformation was working. By the early 1960s, Pontiac had climbed to third place in industry sales, behind only Chevrolet and Ford. Then, in January 1963, General Motors corporate leadership made a decision that would change Pontiac's trajectory forever. GM banned factory-supported racing across all its divisions. No more NASCAR. No more drag racing. No more factory race teams. The ban devastated Pontiac. Racing had been central to the division's performance image. Knudsen had used racing success to transform Pontiac from grandmother's car into a genuine performance brand. Now that strategy was gone. Pontiac needed a new way to sell excitement, and a young engineer named John DeLorean was about to give them one. Chapter 3: The GTO Revolution. John DeLorean, Bill Collins, and Russ G. had a routine. Most Saturday mornings, they'd meet at GM's Milford Proving Grounds for informal brainstorming sessions. No corporate oversight, no formal agenda, just three engineers talking about cars and possibilities. They called them what-if sessions. One Saturday in 1963, they put a prototype 1964 Pontiac Le Mans coupe up on a lift and examined the drivetrain components. The Le Mans was Pontiac's mid-sized car, smaller than the full-sized Bonneville and Catalina, aimed at younger buyers who wanted something sportier than their parents drove. Collins was studying the engine bay when an idea struck him. Collins said, "It would take about 20 minutes to stick a 389 in here." DeLorean's response was immediate. "Let's try it." The 389 cubic inch V8 was Pontiac's big engine, designed for full-sized cars. It made serious power. The Le Mans came standard with a 326 cubic inch V8, plenty adequate but not exciting. What Collins realized was that Pontiac's engines shared the same external dimensions and mounting points regardless of displacement. The swap would be mechanically simple. They made the swap that same morning. DeLorean drove the result, a Le Mans coupe with a 389 topped with tri-power carburation, bolted to a 4-speed manual transmission. The car was a revelation. Fast, responsive, thrilling. Everything a performance car should be. And importantly, it was affordable. This wasn't an exotic sports car priced out of reach. This was a practical, mid-sized coupe that anyone could buy. There was just one problem. GM had a corporate policy limiting intermediate-sized cars to a maximum of 330 cubic inches. The policy existed to prevent divisions from cannibalizing each other's sales and to maintain clear distinctions between vehicle classes. A 389-powered Le Mans would violate that policy completely. But DeLorean had found a loophole. The policy applied to new models, which required corporate approval before production. Option packages, however, didn't require the same level of scrutiny. If they offered the 389 as an option package on the existing Le Mans, they could bypass the approval process entirely. DeLorean called it the GTO option, naming it after Ferrari's 250 GTO, Gran Turismo Omologato. The name was audacious, almost arrogant. Ferrari's GTO was an exotic racing car that cost a fortune. Pontiac was putting those letters on an American mid-sized coupe that a working person could afford. The automotive press would either love it or mock it mercilessly. DeLorean reached out to Jim Wangers, a vice president at Pontiac's advertising agency, and asked him to promote the car to young Americans. Show them what driving for fun could mean. Wangers created advertising that sold excitement, freedom, and performance. The campaigns worked brilliantly. Pontiac dealers started taking orders for the GTO option package in late 1963. The orders came in fast. Very fast. By the time GM's 14th floor executives, the corporate brass who ran the company, realized what was happening, Pontiac had already taken 5,000 dealer orders. There was no killing the program now. The cars were real, the orders were placed, and shutting it down would infuriate dealers and disappoint thousands of customers. The Pontiac GTO, Officially launched in September 1963 as a 1964 model. Pontiac projected they might sell 5,000 units. They sold 32,450 in the first year. The GTO was a phenomenon. Other manufacturers scrambled to respond. Oldsmobile rushed out the 442. Chevrolet developed the Chevelle SS. Buick created the Skylark Grand Sport. Ford, Chrysler, and every other American automaker started dropping big engines into mid-sized cars. The muscle car era had begun, and Pontiac had started it. DeLorean became a star. In 1965, at just 40 years old, he was promoted to head the entire Pontiac division, the youngest division head in General Motors history. His success with the GTO had proven he understood what young buyers wanted. Now he had the authority to shape Pontiac's entire lineup. In 1967, DeLorean introduced the Firebird, Pontiac's answer to Ford's wildly successful Mustang. The Firebird shared its basic structure with Chevrolet's Camaro, but Pontiac gave it unique styling, different suspension tuning, and more powerful engine options. The Firebird became an instant icon, particularly the high-performance Trans Am variant that would arrive a few years later. In 1969, DeLorean redesigned the Grand Prix, giving it a dramatically long hood, sleek proportions, and a sporty character despite being based on Pontiac's full-sized platform. The redesigned Grand Prix sold over 112,000 units in its first year, nearly 4 times the previous year's sales. That same year, DeLorean was promoted again, this time to head Chevrolet, GM's flagship division. He left Pontiac at its absolute peak. The division was profitable, exciting, and culturally relevant. The GTO, Firebird, and Grand Prix were stars. Pontiac had become exactly what Bunky Knudsen had envisioned, GM's performance brand. The 1970s would test whether Pontiac could maintain that identity as the world changed around it. Chapter 4. The Performance Peak. The 1970s should have killed the muscle car. Everything about the decade seemed designed to destroy high-performance automobiles. But Pontiac found ways to keep the excitement alive longer than anyone expected. The decade started strong. The GTO was still selling well, and the Firebird was gaining momentum. In 1969, Pontiac introduced the Trans Am as a high-performance variant of the Firebird. Named after the Trans-American Sedan Racing Series, the Trans Am featured handling upgrades, more powerful engines, and aggressive styling. Early sales were modest, just 689 Trans Ams were built in 1969, but the car was building a following. Then came 1973, and everything changed. The Arab oil embargo sent gas prices soaring. Americans waited in long lines at gas stations, sometimes for hours, just to fill their tanks. Suddenly, owning a car that got 10 miles per gallon seemed less like fun and more like financial suicide. Sales of muscle cars collapsed across the industry. Making matters worse, the federal government imposed increasingly strict emissions regulations. The Clean Air Act required automakers to dramatically reduce pollutants from their engines. The technology to do that while maintaining performance didn't exist yet, so manufacturers strangled their engines with crude emissions equipment, and horsepower ratings plummeted. A 1970 GTO with a 400 cubic inch engine made 366 horsepower. By 1974, that same engine made 200 horsepower. The GTO died in 1974, a victim of emissions regulations and changing buyer preferences. Sales had fallen from 32,000 in its first year to just 7,058 in its last. The car that started the muscle car era was gone, but the Trans Am survived. More than survived, it thrived. How? Pontiac adapted. They couldn't build engines as powerful as before, so they focused on styling, handling, and marketing. The Trans Am of the mid-1970s wasn't as fast as the muscle cars of the 1960s, but it looked fast. The giant screaming chicken decal on the hood, the aggressive stance, the dramatic styling, It all sold excitement even if the performance numbers didn't match the glory days. Then in 1977, something unexpected happened. The movie Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters, starring Burt Reynolds and a black Pontiac Trans Am with gold trim. The film became a massive hit, the second highest grossing movie of 1977, beaten only by Star Wars. The Trans Am became a cultural phenomenon. Pontiac dealers couldn't keep Trans Ams in stock. People who had never considered buying a Pontiac suddenly wanted the car Burt Reynolds drove. Trans Am sales exploded. In 1976, Pontiac sold about 46,000 Trans Ams. By 1979, that number had jumped to over 117,000. The Smokey and the Bandit effect was real and sustained. The Trans Am's success was crucial for Pontiac. While other muscle cars had faded away, the Plymouth Roadrunner, the Dodge Charger RT, even Chevrolet's Chevelle SS, Pontiac kept the performance dream alive. The cars weren't as powerful as they'd been in 1970, but they were still exciting, still desirable, still Pontiac. The rest of Pontiac's lineup evolved to meet 1970s realities. Cars got smaller to meet fuel economy standards. Engines got weaker to meet emissions rules. But Pontiac tried harder than most GM divisions to maintain some connection to performance. Even the Grand Prix, which had grown into a personal luxury car, offered sporty variants with handling packages and available V8 engines. By 1979, Pontiac had survived the worst decade for performance cars in American history. The Trans Am was still selling. The Firebird line was healthy. The Grand Prix remained popular. And while the GTO was gone, Pontiac had maintained its identity as GM's performance division better than anyone could have expected. The 1980s would bring Pontiac to its absolute peak. And then, slowly at first, everything would start to fall apart. Chapter 5: The Peak and the Problem. 1984. Pontiac sold 850,000 cars that year, the highest sales total in the division's history. Dealers couldn't keep inventory on their lots. The Trans Am was a cultural icon. The Grand Prix was everywhere. The new Fiero sports car was generating buzz. Pontiac seemed unstoppable. But something was already wrong, something that wouldn't become obvious for years. General Motors was quietly destroying what made Pontiac special. The problem was platform sharing. In the 1960s and 1970s, Pontiac had built unique cars. The GTO was distinctly Pontiac. The Firebird shared some components with the Camaro, but Pontiac engineers gave it different suspension tuning, unique styling, and a separate identity. Even when Pontiac shared platforms with other GM divisions, they felt different enough that buyers could justify choosing Pontiac over Chevrolet or Oldsmobile. In the 1980s, that changed. GM's corporate leadership became obsessed with cost-cutting. They decided that having multiple divisions engineer similar cars was wasteful. Why should Pontiac develop its own intermediate sedan when Chevrolet already had one? Why create unique components when you could share them across divisions and save money? So GM started forcing Pontiac to share more and more with Chevrolet. Same platforms, same engines, same transmissions, same suspensions. The only differences were badge placement and minor styling changes, slightly different grills, different taillights, maybe some unique trim pieces. This practice became known as badge engineering, and it was killing what made Pontiac special. The Pontiac 6000, introduced in 1982, was essentially a rebadged Chevrolet celebrity. The Pontiac Grand Am of the mid-1980s shared its platform, engine, and most components with the Chevrolet Cavalier and Oldsmobile Calais. The Pontiac Sunbird was a badge-engineered Chevrolet Cavalier. The Pontiac Bonneville shared everything important with the Buick LeSabre and Oldsmobile Delta 88. Buyers noticed. Why pay more for a Pontiac when you could get essentially the same car as a Chevrolet for less money? What was the point of Pontiac if the cars were just Chevrolets with different badges? The performance image that DeLorean and Knudsen had built was being diluted with every new model that shared components with cheaper GM brands. There were exceptions. The Fiero, introduced in 1984, was genuinely unique, a mid-engine two-seat sports car that only Pontiac sold. It was innovative, using a space frame construction with plastic body panels. The Fiero generated enormous excitement and sold well initially, but GM refused to give Pontiac the budget to properly develop the car. Early Fieros had quality problems and underpowered engines. By the time Pontiac had sorted out the issues and created a genuinely good sports car, GM killed the program. The last Fiero was built in 1988. The Trans Am and Firebird continued through the 1980s, still unique to Pontiac, still selling on performance and style. But even those cars were sharing more components with the Camaro than ever before. The differences were becoming cosmetic rather than fundamental. Despite these problems, Pontiac was still selling cars. That 850,000 unit peak in 1984 proved buyers still wanted Pontiacs. But the seeds of the division's destruction had been planted. GM's cost-cutting strategy was teaching buyers that Pontiac wasn't really different from Chevrolet. Once buyers learned that lesson, why would they pay the Pontiac premium? By the late 1980s, Pontiac was facing an identity crisis. The division that had invented the muscle car, that had sold excitement, that had been GM's performance brand. What was it now? A collection of rebadged Chevrolets with slightly different styling? A premium brand without anything genuinely premium to offer? The 1990s would make the identity crisis even worse, and sales would start sliding in a way they never fully recovered from. Chapter 6. The Lost Decade. If the 1980s saw Pontiac begin to lose its identity, the 1990s completed the transformation into a brand that no longer knew what it was supposed to be. The Pontiac lineup of the 1990s read like a catalog of badge-engineered mediocrity. The Sunfire was a rebadged Chevrolet Cavalier. The Grand Am was a slightly restyled Oldsmobile Alero and Chevrolet Malibu. The Bonneville shared its platform with virtually every other GM full-sized sedan. Even the Trans Sport minivan was just a Chevrolet Lumina APV with different plastic cladding. Pontiac tried to maintain some visual distinction by adding plastic body cladding to everything. Ribbed plastic panels ran along the doors and fenders of nearly every model in the lineup. The idea was to make Pontiacs look more aggressive and sporty, even when they weren't. In practice, it just made Pontiacs look like Chevrolets wearing plastic armor. The automotive press started mocking Pontiac's Tupperware styling. Sales reflected the identity problem. After peaking at 850,000 units in 1984, Pontiac sales began a long, slow decline. The numbers would bounce around from year to year, sometimes up a bit, sometimes down, but the overall trajectory was downward. Younger buyers, the demographic Pontiac had courted since the 1960s, were increasingly choosing imports. Japanese brands like Honda and Toyota offered better quality and reliability. European brands offered genuine performance. Pontiac offered rebadged Chevrolets. There were a few bright spots. The Firebird and Trans Am continued through most of the decade, and the fourth-generation models introduced in 1993 looked fantastic. Low, wide, aggressive, they finally looked as exciting as Trans Ams had in the 1970s, and the performance was genuinely good, with available V8 engines that could actually move the car. But Firebird sales were modest compared to the glory days, and the car couldn't carry the entire division. The Bonneville, completely redesigned for 1992, was actually a decent car, smooth, comfortable, and reasonably attractive. The supercharged SSEI variant offered genuine performance for a large sedan, but the Bonneville was competing against a flood of excellent imports and wasn't distinctive enough to win many buyers away from Lexus, Acura, or even Ford and Chrysler. As the 1990s progressed, Pontiac became increasingly irrelevant. The division that had once defined automotive excitement was now just another GM brand selling slightly modified versions of Chevrolets to buyers who hadn't yet figured out they could save money by buying the Chevrolet instead. GM's leadership seemed unable or unwilling to fix the problem. Pontiac needed unique products, genuine performance, and a clear identity. What they got was more badge engineering, more shared platforms, and more confusion about what Pontiac was supposed to represent. By the end of the 1990s, industry analysts were openly questioning whether GM needed Pontiac at all. The division wasn't offering anything that couldn't be found in Chevrolet's lineup. It wasn't making GM significant money, and its once powerful brand image had been thoroughly diluted by a decade of badge-engineered mediocrity. The 2000s would bring a few final attempts to save Pontiac, but by then it might have already been too late. Chapter 7. The Last Chance. In the early 2000s, Pontiac got one last chance to prove it deserved to exist. GM gave the division a series of genuinely exciting products, cars that finally delivered on the performance promise that Pontiac had abandoned for years. But the comeback arrived just as the entire automotive industry was heading toward catastrophe. The Pontiac GTO returned in 2004 after a 30-year absence. GM imported the car from Australia, where its subsidiary Holden built a rear-wheel drive V8 coupe called the Monaro. Rebadged as a Pontiac, the GTO featured a 5.7-liter V8, making 350 horsepower, later upgraded to a 6.0-liter, making 400 horsepower. The car was genuinely fast and genuinely good, but it looked too conservative. The original GTO had been aggressive and exciting. This new version looked like a grown-up's car. Handsome, but understated. Pontiac enthusiasts wanted something that screamed performance. What they got was a car that whispered it. Sales were disappointing. The GTO was discontinued after 2006. Then came the Solstice in 2005. Finally, Pontiac had a unique product again, a small, two-seat roadster that looked fantastic and drove even better. The Solstice shared its platform with the Saturn Sky, but Pontiac's version had more aggressive styling and better performance options. The turbocharged GXP variant made 260 horsepower and could reach 60 miles per hour in just over 5 seconds. It was fun, affordable, and actually exciting to drive. The Solstice generated real enthusiasm. Car magazines loved it. Buyers wanted it. Pontiac finally had something to be proud of. But GM didn't give the Solstice enough production capacity. Buyers faced long waiting lists. Some dealers marked up prices well above sticker. And by the time production ramped up, the market was already shifting. In 2008, Pontiac introduced the G8 sedan, another Holden import from Australia. The G8 was a revelation, a full-sized sedan with rear-wheel drive and a V8 engine that made up to 415 horsepower in GXP trim. It handled well, rode smoothly, and offered genuine sports sedan performance at a reasonable price. Automotive journalists raved. The G8 proved Pontiac could still build exciting cars when given the right products. But these successes were exceptions in a lineup still dominated by badge-engineered vehicles. The G5 was a rebadged Chevrolet Cobalt. The G6 was Pontiac's version of the Chevrolet Malibu. The Torrent was a rebadged Chevrolet Equinox. Even as Pontiac was finally getting some genuinely good performance cars, the bulk of its sales came from vehicles that reinforced the rebadged Chevrolet reputation. And then, in 2008, everything collapsed. The financial crisis hit the American economy like a sledgehammer. The housing market crashed, banks failed, credit markets froze, and consumers stopped buying cars. Industry-wide sales plummeted. General Motors, already struggling with high labor costs, excessive production capacity, and too many brands was bleeding cash at an alarming rate. GM's sales had been declining for years. The company that had once controlled over 50% of the American market was down to about 22%. Toyota had passed GM to become the world's largest automaker. And now, with the economy in freefall, GM was running out of money, fast. In late 2008, GM's leadership traveled to Washington, D.C. to ask Congress for a bailout. Without federal assistance, the company would run out of cash within months. Bankruptcy seemed inevitable, and everyone knew that bankruptcy would mean dramatic changes to GM's restructure. The Solstice, the G8, the GTO, they had shown that Pontiac could still build exciting cars. But they had come too late. The financial crisis was about to force GM to make decisions about which brands would survive and which would be sacrificed. Pontiac had run out of time. Chapter 8. The Day GM Killed Pontiac. On April 27, 2009, General Motors announced that Pontiac would be discontinued. The brand that had invented the muscle car, that had sold excitement for decades, that had built some of the most iconic American cars ever made, it would be gone by the end of 2010. The decision came as part of GM's desperate attempt to avoid total collapse. The company was losing billions of dollars. Federal bailout negotiations required GM to drastically restructure. That meant cutting brands, closing factories, and eliminating tens of thousands of jobs. GM had 8 brands in North America: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, GMC, Saturn, and Hummer. Oldsmobile had already been killed off in the early 2000s. Now GM needed to cut deeper. The question was which brands to keep and which to kill. Chevrolet was untouchable. GM's volume brand, its bread and butter, its connection to mainstream America. Cadillac was safe. The luxury brand, still prestigious, still profitable enough to justify its existence. GMC survived because its trucks were profitable and didn't significantly overlap with Chevrolet's offerings. The margins on GMC trucks helped subsidize other parts of GM's business. Buick seemed likely to die. The brand was selling poorly in the United States, barely 100,000 units a year. But Buick had one thing going for it: China. Through a series of historical accidents, Buick had become one of the most popular luxury brands in China. Killing Buick in America would damage the brand's image in China, where it was making GM significant money. So Buick survived. That left Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, and Saab on the chopping block. All 4 brands were unprofitable. All 4 were redundant in various ways. And GM couldn't afford to keep all of them. Pontiac's problem was simple. The division didn't offer anything unique. Nearly every Pontiac had a Chevrolet equivalent that cost less. More fundamentally, Pontiac had no clear identity anymore. The performance image had been diluted by decades of badge engineering. Younger buyers didn't see Pontiac as exciting. They saw it as their parents' brand, the cars their parents had driven in the 1980s. The "We Build Excitement" slogan rang hollow when most Pontiacs were rebadged economy cars. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It was the 4th largest bankruptcy in United States history. The federal government provided billions in assistance. In return, GM would restructure completely. 4 brands would die: Pontiac, Saturn, Hummer, and Saab. Pontiac production wound down through the second half of 2009. The last Firebird had been built years earlier, in 2002. The Solstice production ended. The G8 was discontinued despite being an excellent car. By late 2009, Pontiac was down to just a handful of models, all of them badge-engineered versions of Chevrolets. On January 4, 2010, a Monday morning, workers at General Motors' Orion Township Assembly plant in Michigan built the last Pontiac. It was a white G6 sedan with a 2.4-liter 4-cylinder engine. A fleet car. Nothing special. Before the car left the factory floor, workers opened the trunk, pulled back the spare tire cover, and signed their names in Sharpie marker. A quiet memorial to 84 years of history. The car was shipped to Idaho and put into rental service. After about a year shuttling travelers around Boise, it was auctioned to a dealer in Colorado, then sold to another dealer in Kansas. An 82-year-old woman bought it there and drove it as her daily car for over a decade. She had no idea she owned the last Pontiac ever made. In 2023, the Pontiac Transportation Museum tracked her down. Tim Dye, the museum's executive director, explained what she had. It took 4 months to convince her to sell. Eventually, a friend of the museum bought the car and donated it. After some minor restoration work to fix scratched paint on the front bumper, the last Pontiac went on display in Pontiac, Michigan, the city where it all began. On October 31, 2010, Pontiac dealer franchise agreements officially expired. The brand was gone. Dealerships that had sold Pontiacs for generations closed or converted to selling other GM brands. The Arrowhead badge disappeared from American roads. 84 years of Pontiac. From the companion car that killed Oakland to the GTO that invented the muscle car. From the Trans Am that became a movie star to the badge-engineered mediocrity that killed the brand's identity. All of it was over. The story of Pontiac isn't a story about bankruptcy destroying a healthy company. It's a story about a corporation slowly killing one of its own brands through decades of bad decisions. Pontiac didn't fail because it couldn't build good cars. The GTO proved Pontiac could invent entirely new categories of automobiles. The Firebird and Trans Am proved Pontiac could compete with anyone on performance. The Solstice and G8 proved that even in the 2000s, Pontiac could still build exciting vehicles when given the chance. Pontiac failed because General Motors destroyed what made it special. Every time GM forced Pontiac to share platforms with Chevrolet, every time they badge-engineered another mediocre sedan, every time they chose cost savings over brand identity, they taught customers that Pontiac wasn't worth the premium. By the 2000s, that lesson had been learned too well. The bankruptcy just made it official. Pontiac was killed in 2009, but it had been dying for decades. What makes it tragic is what was lost. Pontiac invented the muscle car. That's not marketing hype. It's historical fact. The 1964 GTO created a category that defined American automotive culture. Ford, Chrysler, and every other manufacturer followed Pontiac's lead. The muscle car era, the horsepower wars, the street racing, the entire culture that grew up around powerful American cars started with 3 Pontiac engineers and a 389 cubic inch V8. That legacy deserved better than a white G6 rental car as its final act. But at least that car survived. It sits now in the Pontiac Transportation Museum, signed by the workers who built it. A memorial to 84 years of American automotive history. The brand that invented the muscle car couldn't survive. But maybe, in that museum in Michigan, the memory of what Pontiac was, what it could have remained. So now I want to hear from you. What Pontiac did you own? Did you ever drive a GTO? Maybe you had a Firebird or Trans Am. Maybe you learned to drive in a Grand Am or saved up for months to buy a Solstice. Drop a comment below and tell me your Pontiac story. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, share it with someone who appreciates American automotive history, and subscribe to the channel. We're documenting the rise and fall of American companies, the stories of innovation, triumph, and the economic forces that changed everything. There are more stories to tell, and I don't want you to miss them.